everyone. My name is Melody Jones-Poynton.
And I'm the Reverend Thomas de Vermouth.
And we are excited to walk the Sunrise Road together today.
The Sunrise Road podcast is a podcast with conversations that connect and weave hope into the fabric of our shared lives.
Thank you for joining us, and here's this week's conversation.
I am very excited today. Our guest today is Dr. Sten Skreslet, who I know from my time as an exchange student from Switzerland back then in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. Skreslet is Professor of Christian Missions, the R.H. Royster Professor of Christian Missions at the Union Presbyterian Seminary. And some of you listeners may have met him or heard him here at Eastridge a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2016, where the Ethiopian Mission Network Conference met here in our congregation. And Sten gave a presentation on the Islam and the history and development within Islam to our congregation. And I, as with many of our folks, remember that time with us fondly. We are just so excited to have you here this morning, and I can't wait to hear where this conversation will go.
Lovely to be here. I only wish that we could be together in Lincoln.
That would be even better. Yeah. And I just want to start with one thing, because we have been talking on this podcast the last couple times about evangelism and have now kind of turned into the topic of mission. And both topics are big subjects and also kind of subjects that, what should I say, many mainline folks a little bit are ambivalent about or not quite sure what to think about it. A little biographical note: my godfather was a missionary in Indonesia with I think originally was called the China Inland Mission, and then became the Overseas Mission Fellowship. Mm-hmm. And so growing up, my godfather is a big household name. I was very impressed that I had someone there, and I always loved getting special gifts that you would not get here, like clothes or pieces of art. And he is an all-around wonderful person. So I kind of still understand why we so adored him. But in the meantime, also what has happened is that growing up and through education, I learned to understand mission also critically as a outgrowth of the cross follows the trade, or the sword, or the flag. And I've been struggling to kind of put these two words, these two understandings and concepts together. And I was kind of curious if you could help us bring a little order in this mess.
Well, possibly. Of course, there really are two dominant narratives about mission that are floating around, and one of them, which was the dominant narrative up into the 1960s, looked at mission as a benevolent enterprise, selfless, sacrificial kind of extension of care to other people who were not Christian. In the 1960s, another narrative developed, which equated mission with colonialism. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of folk going back, looking at the record, were very critical. And people in university sphere were very critical, anthropologists in particular, critical of mission work. And then the figure of the missionary becomes reinterpreted as not a benevolent figure, but a malevolent figure, someone who is acting for their own purposes and for their own benefit. And many different ways that that social power is exercised, and one of them might be through the missionary enterprise. And so there are many, many studies from the 1960s until the present, where that is the dominant narrative.
Mm.
And so that's the university's narrative, but it also became one that became quite attractive to many Presbyterians and other mainline Protestants. So if you go into a PCUSA congregation these days, most people will want to talk about mission in terms of its colonial past and be very critical of it. There will be a fewer people, but some usually older people in the congregation that have memories like of your relative who was a missionary and apparently a wonderful person, and maybe quite knowledgeable about the world and so forth, and quite respected. And so there will be people who will talk in those terms about mission. But that's kind of where we are right now, is these two competing narratives. And for people in the PCUSA and other mainline Protestants, we're not sure what to do with the legacy, because we celebrate the fact that mission is how the global church came into being. But on the other hand, we're critical of some of the social processes that work themselves out in the course of that history. So that's a lot of what I try to do, actually, is to try to engage with the history of mission with an awareness that it has many different facets, and these different facets will appeal to different constituencies or different audiences. And I think it's important to be in conversation with all different kinds of folk to talk about what mission is and what it has been in the past.
That's very helpful. We have become very active with the South Sudan Mission Network, and we are blessed to count as our good friends Sharon Candle, who is the regional liaison for the Horn of Africa, and Bob and Christy Rice, who are mission coworkers in South Sudan, will be joining us here in October, which is very exciting. And we hosted the Mission Network conference last summer, and we're able to come together, and I find what you're saying is ringing true in me and my soul, that at once there is this great excitement and sort of a humble, I don't know, like I want to say a humility with which we are engaging in work in particular in the South Sudan as a denomination and a congregation. But also there is an awareness that we don't quite know what to do with. And there's kind of conflicting messages of like, this is so great, but how are we doing this? And are we doing this the right way? And how do we walk alongside and not lord over and not try to change other cultures and other people and yet still be part of the same? It's very complicated, which is sort of what I heard you saying, is that we're still working all that out.
We are. Yes. Yeah. So in the PCUSA sphere of things, the concept that has helped a lot of people is this idea of partnership. That mission is essentially an action that involves a number of different actors, and that there needs to be a sense of partnership in mission with the North Atlantic people not necessarily dictating the terms of the partnership. So meaning that Europeans and North Americans are not the ones who decide what partnership should be. But we try to be in conversation with mission partners to determine what it is that we might want to do and how we might want to do it, and what are the different roles that the different actors can play. So that's been a very important concept for PCUSA as a denomination, I would say at least since the 1990s. It's been a kind of guiding concept for us. I've written about that concept from time to time, and one of my critiques is that partnership tells you how you might do mission, but it doesn't tell you what you should do.
Mm.
And so this is like a means rather than a set of ends. And so that's when you get to things like service or evangelism or care and compassion or some other thing. Those are ends. And then partnership might be a means to effect those ends. So that's why we have to be in conversation. And it's not up just to the North Americans to decide what the ends ought to be either.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important to establish relationships as you have done with folk in the South Sudan. And it's very nice also to think in terms of not just bilateral relations, but multilateral relations. So that, for instance, one might be working not just with an individual group in South Sudan, but one might be networked with a number of other organizations who are also working with folk in South Sudan. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's been another useful concept, this idea of networking. And that's how a lot of mission happens today. And that's been true again for 30 years or so. We've had this idea of networking with other organizations. They might be other churches, they might be non-governmental organizations, they might be other religious organizations that we may have some things in common with and have similar things that we would like to see furthered in terms of, let's say, justice or in terms of service to people in need. Might be possible to network with some other entities that are not necessarily Christian or not Presbyterian. So that's been a big part of I think how mission has changed over the last 30, 40 years, something like that.
And that question, I mean, that's an interesting critique that you mentioned there, that the lack of definition of the ends of mission. I just noticed you said that's how mission happens, and again the question is, so what's the goal? Where do we go for it? And how do we negotiate that? I mean, yes, there is a shared tradition through our understanding of Scripture. Great Commission, something like that, and or the Bible's witness to justice, or but how do we negotiate that, also knowing that our partnerships are often also in a power dynamic?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that's one reason why I think multilateral conversations are sometimes very helpful. Because usually in bilateral conversations, one party is much stronger than the other one, right? So if you're talking about the PCUSA in conversation with another entity in South Sudan or some other place, often it's the Western denomination that has all of the financial assets and is used to exercising those assets and making choices about how to use those assets based on their own needs as an organization, and with an ear toward the donors who give the money for this and that sort of thing, and so often responsive to those voices more than we might be responsive to other voices that are not sharing our context. So that's why I think it's really important, as you have already begun to do or already been doing, to be in relationship, because it's only in relationship that you can really hear what other people think is important and the sort of goals that they might see that you might not perceive on your own. Even if you went to go visit, you still might not perceive some of these deep needs that might be there, and some of the long-term goals that people are envisioning in their own context. And it takes a little while to be in conversation and to discern together. But I think that's one of the gifts of mission, is that it is a kind of framework within which those kinds of relationships can be nurtured. You know, just an intention to be in mission together is a very good starting point. And then the question of deciding what it is that you want to do together can be worked out.
Mhm.
So don't know if that hits the sort of things that you're thinking about or not, Thomas.
Absolutely, yes.
I think that one of the things that has occurred to me as we've developed these relationships here as a congregation, and it keeps coming up, and it's kind of a theme in a lot of these conversations about evangelism and mission, is that these things don't happen immediately, and they're nurtured over time. These relationships are nurtured over time, and sometimes it seems to me that our lack of understanding the other setting or the context of the other may lead to some uncomfortable moments. And I'm thinking in particular about what happened earlier this year in the South Sudan with the Pope's visit. And the Pope visited, and the moderator of the Church of Scotland visited, and our PCUSA moderator visited, and it was a glorious event for many in South Sudan, and the Pope definitely took up the most of the news, and he kept saying, "Basta, this is enough. We've got to work together." But it seems to me that one of the things I would maybe humbly offer is that while the visit was important and it helped South Sudan to feel like they were being seen, there needs to be some, you can't just go and say, "Basta, enough," and then have things be different. I mean, there is a need for peace and reconciliation in South Sudan, and in Sudan. Clearly right now there's a lot of violence. And I don't know that we, and I would speak as a white American in a mainline denomination, that we always understand how to be a part of that in ways that are truly helpful.
That is one of the advantages of having some long-serving mission persons.
Mm-hmm.
Because we often think about short-term mission as the way to go. It involves the most people and so forth, but it is often very helpful to have a few long-term people that are engaged and who help those who visit to read the context, mm-hmm. and to help hear what people may have to say to them. So, you know, the Catholic Church is in the middle of a huge process that they're calling a synodical process, where there's this attempt for the center of the church, you know, the Vatican and the papal bureaucracy and so forth, to be in a process of listening to the rest of the church. And it's almost like a follow-on to the Vatican II processes that were launched from the 1960s. So Vatican sponsors African synods, and there's been a series of them. And these are events where the Africans themselves, Catholic Africans, have control of the process. Mm-hmm. And it's a way to be in conversation for whole regions of the continent, to be in conversation with each other, so that Ugandans and South Sudanese and Ethiopian Catholics can be talking to each other, but then they're also in conversation with these European entities in particular that are also involved. So Pope goes and he has ceremonial events, but I don't think Pope thinks that that's the end of the conversation by any means. And his own experience as a archbishop in Latin America, he knows how these things might go on a local and a regional level, and I think he's trying to, as you say, give recognition to the actual situation of people in South Sudan. Say you're not forgotten, but I think there are a lot of other things going on beyond the sort of ceremonial visit
that may not always get reported in the news.
Right, because it's not as spectacular, and it's much harder to cover. Yeah. Because your journalist would have to actually know something about the setting, and there's so few journalists now who have that kind of expertise, and so much of the journalism about the world outside the North Atlantic is now just about these few individuals and what they say and do, when there's all this reality that's going on at a local level. But you have to be able to be part of that experience to understand what's actually going on. And most journalists don't have time to do that. Mm-hmm. And they're covering 6 different places at the same time, and living in Rome and jetting here and there and so forth. So
really then our mission coworkers are a great place for us to be understanding what is happening in other parts of the world where we're wondering, what's really going on. I know we get newsletters and communication from mission coworkers who are living there alongside and working together with our mission partners. So that's helpful for us to know, I think, that the expectation isn't that the moderator of the Peace USA went and toured around the South Sudan and now everything's fine. Our mission coworkers have been there and will continue to be there to work for peace and reconciliation, in particular in South Sudan.
Yeah. Which isn't to say that they're the sole means by which mission happens in that place, but they're a kind of key node in communication system. And then also they're a person who has relationships that most of us outside that context don't have. And so there's, they can help make connections, and that can be really valuable for everybody involved.
That's a plea for supporting our mission coworkers and the long time memory. And it is. That may be a rabbit hole, but I mean, in some ways, I see there's a similar dynamic at play between the decline of news media and the ways to find support, long-time correspondence, and the support of mission-led interpreters for international partnerships. We think we can cover this through, I don't know, following people's social medias from out of different kind of places, and that makes up for that, for the history and for the complexity of a setting. Sorry, that's just a rant, I guess.
I didn't hear that as a rant. I heard that as thoughtful
Yeah.
reflection.
So
What do you,
I guess
go ahead, Thomas.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I want to go forward to future at some point, but I'm not sure if you had another one first before that. No, so these are some things that are 19th century mission and up to the 1960s, and the critique of mission through the critique of colonialism and all this societal changes. I think that's helpful to get some understanding, and but how do we move in this new century? How do we further? Is there a place for mission, and how can we help? How can we be actors in that? Because I think there are a lot of actors in there that are going to step in if we don't.
Yeah. So, churches have something to share that secular actors and people in other religious traditions don't have to share, don't want to share. There's a gospel message that the church has and can share. Church also, and folk related to the church, have a commitment, or should have a commitment, to live in ways that illustrate that gospel message, living in community with others who share the same beliefs, but also living in community with others who are not part of our faith community. And I think church also has an invitation to share with people outside of the church to become followers of Jesus Christ, to be disciples. So we can illustrate what discipleship might mean. We can share scripture resources, and we can live in ways that are consistent with the message that we attempt to share. Those are things we can do that I don't think anyone else can. That's part of our mission as a church. Now, our problem is, of course, that we're very diffident about sharing what's unique to the church because of the legacy of our past. And so we're often sometimes even ashamed of part of the history of mission, and we're afraid of making the same mistakes that our previous generations have made. But if you're going to step out in faith as a disciple of Jesus Christ, you are called to share that message and to live in those distinctive ways on the basis of that message with those with whom you come in contact. So we can make that kind of appeal as individuals, but even more important is how we do that as corporate bodies. So as congregations in Lincoln, Nebraska, for instance, or other places in America, or in Cairo, Egypt, or South Sudan, or wherever. Everybody's watching. Everybody is thinking, what is different about this group? What is distinctive about this group and how they live? And so we're always on in that way as corporate witnesses to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're always on. It's not just Sunday morning. And everybody's watching. How are they living? So part of what you asked is about the future, and I think that's one of the things that that we might want to work on is being a little bit more self-reflective on the content and also the means of mission, and to reflect on those, and to do that together, knowing that what we say and also what we do is becomes part of the message.
Mm. What I hear, and I may be reading this into what you've said, but I think for us to imagine what the future of mission is and what that means, we need to acknowledge the past, and you said the mistakes, to be reflective on the mistakes, as well as to understand with some humility where those areas are that have been good, because we have done some good things. I would say, there's been some good intentions and definitely some good work done. We have here from our congregation two members, one of whom has passed now, but who were in Africa and India, and they were doing medical missions, and they tell this wonderful story about bringing in I think it was Jim McGill's dad was coming and was going to be the missionary that followed them, and he was a medical missionary as well. And Paul Jewett was a doctor, and said, "Well, this is how you help someone who's having a baby." And he said, "Oh, I'm not that kind of doctor." And the Jewetts just laughed and said, "Well, you are now." So there's there's definitely some in that sacrifice and in that mission activity that we can't just dismiss it all. And I think some, as you said, some reflective sorting out of like, how have we, how can we lift up those areas? And I don't know if you're familiar with Dana Roberts' book, Faithful Friendships, but yes. How can we lift up the friendships and the relationships? To me, the value of mission is simply being a connected church. There's value in being a connected denomination here in our country. There's value in being connected with other churches in other parts of the world, and understanding that we're all in this together and walking alongside together. How do we do that without demanding somebody else be just like us? And for me, that's the big question going forward, is how do we engage in those faithful friendships,
yes,
and allow ourselves to be changed by them.
That's a wonderful book. And actually, the book is based on lectures that she gave at our seminary.
Oh.
Yeah. So she gave the Sprint lectures one year, and then published them like the next year. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like the image of friendship, and still where I struggle is, and every friendship has that, the difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. And in what spirit do we approach those difficult conversations? Like when our mission partner, based on the same gospel that our ancestors brought them, teaches an order that is highly patriarchal, for instance, or homophobic, or what do I do with the belief in spiritual warfare of my mission partner? And that is so strange to me. And so how do I navigate that sense, not to approach the conversation from a sense of moral superiority, and yet it's still there?
Yeah. But see, you can represent yourself and your point of view at the same time that you're listening to point of view that might be different from yours, and you can be in conversation about that without assuming that you've already reached the conclusion that they ought to draw. Mm-hmm. And see, that's one of the big factors, is when we go into a conversation knowing how it ought to end, right? And even some of these ways of being in community that many of us in the West just can't countenance at all. It's still possible to be in conversation with folk, and if we're in a true conversation, we might affect each other. Mm-hmm. And that we go into it with the idea that we might actually affect each other, rather than always in one direction. And that's a little something different than I think in previous generations, where it was pretty much assumed that the West had worked it out, and now we're going to share this product with you. Mm-hmm. And it will be accepted in the form that we have already given to it. And I think in our situation, postmodern situation, everything is fluid, everything is negotiable, and everybody has a point of view that deserves to be heard, even if we don't agree with it.
Thank you for.
That's really messy. It's difficult. Sorry.
No, that's. Thank you for saying, because I really believe that we there is a sacredness and an openness of acknowledging that we need to change, and that our relationship with someone else might change us, and going into it. And it does allow for a certain sort of messiness in the middle of listening to so many. And I happen to have Thomas's copy of one of your books here. But I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about that discussion and how that happens in the middle of other world religions. That it's, this interfaith dialogue. And when you were here with us before, you shared with us, and still I would say the majority of what I know about Islam came from you, and the fascinating parts about all the culture of, carrying over. And it was just so eye-opening to understand, how do we have this dialogue, this openness, and this relationship with people of other religions without anticipating that we have something to offer and make them into.
Yeah. So that's one of the possibilities, is that we have a set conclusion, which is the conversion of the other to what we are. That's one possibility. Another one that has, and I don't think we want to go there. Another one that has often been operable is, let's bracket all of the difficult questions and not talk about them, right? So if I'm in conversation with Muslims, I'm going to agree not to talk about the incarnation, not to talk about the Trinity, not to talk about Jesus as a divine figure, right? And that even before we're in conversation, many people have been urging people that want to be in dialogue with Muslims that you have to leave those difficult things out of the conversation. My own feeling is that as soon as you do that, you are less authentic than you otherwise might have been. That even
Makes
when
for a
you
rather
enter
bland
the
tea party.
conversation, you're not your full self if you're bracketing out some of your core beliefs. Mm-hmm. So I don't go into the conversation saying, I want to project my beliefs on you. but I also don't want to negate who I am in order to be in conversation with you. And my own experience, 10 years in Egypt, speaking with lots of Muslim people about Christianity and about Islam and so forth, is that people are quite interested to talk to people who are different from them, and that it's not necessarily off-putting for people to talk about some of these core beliefs of Christians and to say, this is what I believe. This is who I am. And I'm interested in knowing who you are and what you believe. And then let's talk some more about some of these issues. And there's some really great conversations that can happen, even as we bring our differences into conversation. And that sometimes those conversations are much more satisfying than ones in which we're just going to restrict ourselves to the easy things that we can agree on even before we started our conversation. That those aren't very interesting conversations at all. And a lot of ecumenical dialogue, a lot of formal ecumenical dialogue has been conducted with this bracketing of core beliefs, because it was thought that that's the only way you could be in conversation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
let's assume we're all the same to start with, and that may not necessarily be the most fruitful conversation. Yeah. I mean, in part, we are all the same. Mm-hmm. We're human beings. We have human needs. We are affected by social forces in much the same way. But we might make meaning in different ways. Mm. And it might be helpful for me to understand how you make meaning in your context, and for me to share how I make meaning and derive my self-understanding in my context. And we can share these things, and we might learn something from each other. That would be a lovely thing.
That would be a lovely thing. And go ahead, Thomas. Go.
I think we're entering the finish line here, and I think that's actually a really good vote for the for closing statement. I think. Yeah.
I was just going to say that would be a lovely thing, in the same way this conversation has just been lovely. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. You've got a lot coming up in your life. So congratulations, and many well wishes on your future as you look to end school years and academic years and all those other things. Thank you so much. Your work has been a gift to the church, a labor of love, and you can feel that. So thank you for spending this time and sharing it with us.
I appreciate what you're trying to do with the podcast. And my sense is that you're creating something that can be shared within the congregation, and others who are kind of tangential to the congregation but are aware of what you're doing. And then perhaps some new friends out there. And also it strikes me that the two of you, this is a way that you're getting to know each other better. As you bring up different topics and you have different points of view on those. And that's a beautiful thing too.
We still have a lot to discover about each other, even after for 10 years of the same.
10 years of working together. And what we like to tell our people and point out is that we actually disagree about quite a few things. So we believe that keeps our working relationship and is a model. You know, we don't have to agree about everything in order to appreciate someone and get along with them and work together with them. So
absolutely.
Yeah, we're
we would love for this conversation to be shared wide and to have new folks join this conversation from wherever they hear us or encounter us.
Yeah. Thank you so
for the
much.
invitation.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sunrise Road podcast. Our podcast is hosted by me, Thomas Dummermuth.
And me, Melody Jones-Poynton, and it is edited by Vince Rule.
The Sunrise Road podcast is a ministry of Eastridge Presbyterian Church. Please like and subscribe and leave a review.